Um, I'm Jill Greenfield. I'm a partner at Phil Fisher. I head up the serious injury unit. And Mark, this is Mark Salter. You're a psychiatrist who we've worked together for many
Mm,
years,
we have
dealing
indeed.
with all sorts of unusual scenarios, but never
Mm,
one quite like this. And and we're all finding it difficult working in a strange new world. But I'm really interested, Mark, in your take as a psychiatrist as to
mm.
the impact it's having on people and on vulnerable people. And some of my clients, actually, some of them have said, we've been self-isolating for years, Joel. What's the difference? So some have actually adapted really well.
Yeah.
Others, as time has gone on, seeing things breaking down a little bit. It's becoming much more difficult for them. So I'm interested to hear about that from you, about vulnerable people dealing with it, but also how people like you and I are having to interact now using Zoom, and how actually it's quite hard work. I mean, I
It is.
like the fact, I love the fact seeing my clients' faces and my experts' faces, but the different world in which we're all communicating, I think, is putting a lot of pressure on us. And that in itself is quite exhausting, combined
That's true.
with the fact that we're living in the world of a pandemic. I mean,
Yeah.
just really interested to hear what you have to say about it all, Mark.
Well, Jill, where would we begin, really? I mean, I think first of all, we have to start with the fact that, we're looking at human beings who have brains and have minds and have lives. And if we boil it down to the simplest level, from a psychiatric or a medical point of view, the brain or the mind or the life is something that, by and large, likes stability and predictability. So most of us, when things are going well, our life is predictable and barely manageable, reasonably vaguely manageable. And that means we switch into a relaxed frame of mind where we can measure, we can deliberate and take time. But when things start to change a little more rapidly than we like, either at a viral pandemic level or in the event, say, of abuse or trauma or difficulties in our life, then suddenly our anxiety starts to rack up. Now, anxiety, in my view, is the mother of all mental illnesses, mother of all unhappinesses as well. And some very interesting things happen when we become anxious. I think probably one of the best people to write about this was a guy called Sigmund Freud, but a guy who is much more legible and followable was the poet W.H. Auden, who said in his essay, or a very long poem, The Age of Anxiety, fear like frost will freeze the flood of thought. It's a very interesting idea. This idea that fear freezes our ability to reason and to deliberate. And that means we fall back on, if you like, the more primitive or frightened part of our brain, which is a bit that's been with us for ever since we evolved from apes, which teaches us to look after number one, or number two if you mean your immediate family. And that is what involves withdrawal, flight, isolation, and it also involves a lack of abstract thinking about solutions. It means you then have what you might call an availability issue. You start to look out for everything that is a threat and a risk. Suddenly, things at the edge of your visual field. There's a very loud sound coming through my headphones. What happens is that we start to actually become sensitized to events that are going on in our surroundings that are potential fresh sources of threat. That makes it much harder for us to continue with the more relaxed sort of intercourse and connection with the world that we would have previously had. And I think that really is what lies at the fundamental basis of the difficulties we face with people. We are coping with people who are just about managing with tolerable levels of anxiety. They're slipping us into a state where we're moving into a rather bizarre version of our fight or flight mechanism. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's roughly what we're doing.
Well, it sounds to me like you're talking about almost hyper-vigilance. You've got people who are already vulnerable, who are hyper-vigilant about things and are highly anxious in any event because of their scenarios that they've gone through in life, and the fact that a lot of their usual pathways have been removed, say they've been very seriously injured. But now dealing with this, it really consumes people in terms of what is happening in the world and where they sit within all that. It's very difficult for us to know, are we going to be sitting at home in the next month, the next 2 months, the next 6 months? It's actually really difficult to, everyone likes to think about, we're all planners in one way or another.
Absolutely.
We all try to plan.
That's my point. The planning.
What are we looking forward to now?
Exactly. Well, the planning, the capacity to plan involves the capacity to think rationally about something. It involves envisaging a future. That is switched off, like Alden says. That thought is frozen. Instead, we are doing as we do when we're cornered or frightened, and the more animal part of us, we deal immediately with the issues in the here and now. It makes it very hard for us to see things other than they are at that moment, which is about doing something. You'll very often find, therefore, that we start to display some characteristic changes in the way we think, which is a kind of a very concrete, immediate, reactive, knee-jerk style of thinking, and also the way we feel. Our bodies, for example, will start to tell us all sorts of strange things about the need to sleep, being at a slightly different time from our ordinary sleep. There's an urge to abandon your day-night body cycle. We will reach for richer, sweeter foods. We'll find ourselves nipping off to the fridge a little bit more frequently, or as comfort snacking, and thereby disrupting the very important thing that goes with this day-night sleep cycle, and that's the 1 or 2 meals a day cycle that most of us have. We'll retreat for our favourite tranquilizer, which is usually ethyl alcohol or marijuana for some people, but mainly it's alcohol. And you'll see that, Majestics and other delivery companies are actually skyrocketing in their deliveries at the moment. Of course, we haven't got pubs, but we probably are drinking more than before. The drinking, of course,
actually, that's quite an interesting point, Mark. What about the fact that the way this feels really difficult for people? So normally, even in wartime scenarios, people could come together and support each other in a very physical, sort of see each other kind of way, go down the pub or have a party at home or have a Sunday lunch.
Absolutely.
Family. That is taken away from us. What kind of impact does that have?
Well, I couldn't agree more, Jill. You see, we've talked about the emotional effect and the biological effect I tried to summarise briefly there. But remember, human beings don't just exist in terms of their thinking, their feeling. They exist in terms of their relations to the world. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures, as you've observed. There are things we can do about that. But yeah, the lockdown scenario, of course, invites us withdrawing actively from that social world and confining ourselves to slightly clumsy devices like this one instead. But I think what we then do is create another sense of isolation and distance that perpetuates that sense of fearful circle and loop of worry. So what do? We start looking out for information. We Zoom like crazy, and we communicate with people left, right and centre. We go to news agencies, but look how the thinking and the feeling influences the way we behave. There is something fundamentally unsatisfying about a teleconference, and we'll come to the mechanics of why that might be in a minute. But look at the way we seek out news, for example. We don't go necessarily to our trusted websites, or we don't necessarily go to reliable, trusted websites, which we can identify. I'll come back to that. We go back to the things that have always worked for us: our Instagram accounts, our Facebook friends, or depending upon your age, whatever platform you're using these days. But we are attuned, remember, by our fear, our immediate knee-jerk looking and scanning and vigilance to look out for words like COVID, death, panic, disaster, intensive care unit, ventilators, PPE,
they're trigger words, aren't
they? Dead doctor. They're trigger words. Now, what happens when you log on? Remember the early days before we stopped looking at the news. Remember before Boris Johnson's bulletins were boring? In the first few days, we were all glued to it, were we not? And what did? We lingered on the words that carried the strongest emotional salience, and these words were things that chimed with our own bodily state. We're trying to create a state of constant familiarity, and now in a new, bizarre, crazy world, we're looking to things that resonate with that world to make it seem familiar and testable and safe, thereby lowering our anxiety. Meanwhile, we have the press, who have to feed their children and pay their rent too, who are generating stories that will appeal to us. There's an old line in the media: if it bleeds, it leads. In this case, if it coughs, wheezes and dies, it leads, you see. So what we're doing is we're looking out for COVID positive items. Now, that is at the expense of looking out for the things we probably would have looked out for elsewhere when we were more relaxed and living a broader, more open world, especially because all the things that come to us come through this little, in my case, a 12, 13-inch screen. And if we're not as careful, we can get into this terrible pas de deux with the media. Psychologists call it an availability cascade. You're frightened. Journalists knows they will get your attention by putting in things that are frightening to resonate with you. They'll give you statistics and stories and items. And for example, only one day, not so long ago, I saw an article where a well-known left-wing broadsheet quality newspaper, for which you have to pay to get good quality without adverts, put a long sign that said, WHO predicts global famine as Trump closes America. And there are connections between global famine. Yeah. Very, very, but it doesn't but you'll see that the political agendas of different people being presented to us in a way. So, handy rule number 1, go to trusted websites. Go to the WHO and the BBC. They churn out good stuff, speaking from my point of view as a doctor. Secondly, if you're going to read around, make sure that you read something that disagrees with you. In other words, if you're a Natural Guardian reader, read The Economist, read The Telegraph, or read something completely tabloid that's off. Read what if you're older, you've got kids, read what your kids are reading. The important thing is not to soak up more of the same because of your fearful fixity on a single subject. Does that make sense? Read around.
Yeah.
Stretch your brain so that it's not becoming accustomed to a new normality. Another thing to do, I think, is to be very, very careful, particularly in professional context, with the way that we use the visible screen. And here's another thing. When you and I talk, Jill, on occasions that you and I have met in person, what we're doing is drawing upon 100,000 years of experience of evolution as human beings. The way you are dressed, the way you look at me, the way that as you turn your face even a millimeter, a slight change in the light on your face, your smile, a joke that we might share, the moments we break eye contact, the way we return. The range of the vocal dynamics in our voice from about 50 hertz to about 10,000 kilohertz. The bandwidth of that is generating vast amounts of information. Direct eye contact. Right now I'm looking at you, but actually you're looking at about approximately a dot 2 centimeters above my head and vice versa. It looks as though I'm looking at you, but it's not the real thing. In other words, what we're having right now is something that doesn't pick up on the genuineness of a human interaction to the full extent, and we're deceived by the vividness of the face. There's a huge difference between the vocal dynamic of a microphone and its acoustic range and the difference with the silent sound. When you are at a great distance from someone in isolation and you're asking them to talk about what it was like as they went under the lorry and the wheels went over their legs, or you're talking to a person about child sex abuse and they're talking to you for the first time, it is very, very hard to reach out and establish and maintain an empathic, understanding, caring, some would say loving link with the person at the other end when you're not in the same room. Those squeaks of the chair, those quiet sighs, those breaks of vision, those silent moments. Notice how silence seems so long on Zoom and Blue Jeans and Skype and whatever. It's hard to read the meaning of the silence because the silence is devoid of its context. And that is a very unconscious, subtle manifestation of this creeping unfamiliarity that has already got us living on edge as it is. There are lots of things you can do about that. You can, sit as close to the screen as possible as I'm trying to do. You can...
Come closer, Mark.
Well, it works. If you think about it, you see, you and I are now actually operating at roughly the distance we might be, where in an interview, okay, our noses wouldn't quite be touching as they are because of the distorting effect of this lens. But seriously, if you're going to work with someone, let them know about the artificiality of the moment, of the process before the interview begins. Explain that there's a difference between being in the room. Explain that the things you're going to talk about may be difficult. Give silence long enough to take its effect. Normally when we're embarrassed by silence, usually through anxiety and a need to respond and to leap in and fix, we interrupt the silence prematurely. A good therapist will know about, a good lawyer in an interview will know about the importance of silence, letting it sink in. If someone appears to be getting tearful, you can see that and hear that more effectively if you give them time to actually have that emotion. And we haven't got true eye contact, remember, probably the most powerful form of person-to-person communication there is. You can't hear the low sounds, the sounds of quiet sniffling or sobbing or the flushing of the face, but if you can check the person you're interviewing is well lit and they're quite close, that optimizes the chance of forming a more effective relationship with them and therefore communicating more effectively. These things are very, very important, I think.
That's quite interesting because we first started doing this sort of 5-6 weeks ago, having lots of meetings, and sometimes with a new client, it's a challenge. So
Oh, yeah.
it's, I mean, I find a normal phone call is a more relaxed method. You don't get the same level of connection, obviously, but I quite like the phone as a media of communicating with people. It's quite, you can actually pick up quite a lot from the voice, I think, when people are talking. But I think when people are on screens like this, I become very aware that I'm on a screen to somebody, and suddenly it has a different, and it's quite exhausting sometimes if you're doing a lot of calls like this in a day, because you really have to concentrate. And
yeah, I agree. This comes back to what I was saying just now. When we're switching into fear mode, okay, that switches off parts of our brain that can be more reasoned and measured. And we have to use them to some extent, and that requires more cognitive effort. That means your brain burns more glucose. The act of trying to act as though you're familiar in a situation with which you are completely or relatively unfamiliar burns energy. It is exhausting. And that's another reason why you have to look after your body. Watch not only what comes out of your mouth, but watch what goes into it. And it's very, very important to keep the same sleep cycle and to keep some connections to regularity and normality if you can, by having a clear day-night sleep cycle, downtime, contact with friends, and above all, getting out of the house.